In 2014, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, designated 30th of November each year as a day with a very long title. It's called in English, the Day of the Departure for Zion and the Expulsion of Jews from Arab lands and from Iran. The reason for that choice of date, 30th of November, was because in 1947, the United Nations Partition Plan was passed on November the 29th, and it was to lead not only to Israeli independence, but to difficulties for Jews living across North Africa and the Middle East, who found a new degree of hostility towards them, which eventually led them to leave. In many countries in the Muslim world, hundreds of years of Jewish life slowly dwindled away and vanished. Although Jews never had full equal rights in Muslim societies, they had known for centuries how to live in peace as small but accepted minorities. Ordinary Jews were as often craft workers as they were traders. In medieval Egypt, for example, Jews were able to obtain government contracts to produce coins. Documents from the Cairo Geniza record business partnerships between Jewish and Muslim weavers, goldsmiths, and glassmakers. Maimonides was asked if it was permitted in a Jewish-Muslim business partnership for the Jewish partner to keep the whole profit from Fridays and the Muslim partner from Saturdays. And he said, yes, that's absolutely fine. In Algeria, Jews became jewelers. By the 18th century, perhaps before, they were making exquisite pieces in copper, silver, and gold, fine adornments for those able to afford them. Now, hopefully you can all see the picture, which shows a traditional costume worn by a Jewish woman from the town of Tlemcen. Notice her peaked hat covered with a flowing veil. And some of the pictures show even longer peaks and longer veils, huge ones. That it must have been for very special occasions. Notice too, if you can see it, her necklace, which is made of coins. I go to the next slide because you can probably see it, well, you can see the coins more clearly there. It was a woman's task to drill small holes in each coin so they could be threaded onto the cords. And there you can see her elaborate necklace as well as the coins. Problems for Jews in Algeria were around long, long before today's Middle East conflict. Really, the story starts with the French Revolution. The Jews of Paris petitioned the French National Assembly to remove all the degradations that they'd suffered and that they be declared citizens. Napoleon regulated the professions that Jews could follow, and he distinguished between their national identity and their religious identity. No longer tolerated aliens, but more Jews of the Mosaic faith. Now, this was great for those Jews in German-speaking lands which came under Napoleonic rule. That is part of the background to the beginning of progressive Judaism. There was now freedom to start a different kind of worship. However, in more traditional Jewish societies like Algeria, it wasn't so good. In 1830, Algeria became a colony of France, and the Jews there too were offered French citizenship, but not so many took it up. They felt that they were being asked to trade in their traditional way of life in return for being French citizens, particularly as in Algeria, as in France, they cleared away all the little streets and the small synagogues and the mosques, and they built large institutional ones. Crafts like jewelry were institutionalized and regulated. Gold, which had been an easily attainable precious metal for craft workers, now became a commodity. Not happy with the small numbers of Jews who'd taken up French citizenship in Algeria, in 1870 the French made it compulsory, thus dividing Jews from Muslims permanently, because they remained citizens of Algeria. However, when it came to World War II, the Jews' French citizenship didn't help them at all. In fact, they were deprived of it again. Under Vichy France, some Algerian Jews were sent to labor camps. Yes, after the American troops liberated Algeria, their citizenship was restored. And in fact, the American troops were helped by a group of 400 Jews. Here is a picture of the great synagogue in Algiers, one remaining one of those that the French built. But little good did it do them to have their citizenship back, because after the war, France became more and more unpopular in Algeria, and that synagogue that you can see was ransacked by anti-French rioters in 1960. And so 1962, when Algeria became independent from France, Jews were told by the new government that they could stay in Algeria only if they discarded their French citizenship. But by that time, French was their language, and nearly all of them decided to leave for France, forming the nucleus of the French Jewish community as it exists to this day. If there is anyone here who has an Algerian background, I'd be delighted to talk to you after the service and hear a little bit about it. This history, particularly of the jewelers in Algeria, is well documented in a new book by Ariella Aisha Azoulay called The Jewelers of the Ummah. Ummah in this context means the Muslim world. Aisha's parents were part of a small group of Algerian Jews, about 5% of them, who didn't go to France but chose Israel. And that's where Aisha was born in 1962, where she grew up and began to investigate her family history, and discovered that by the year she was born, there were no Jewish jewelers left at all in Algeria in the Maghreb. And those who went to France were not able to become jewelers there because Jews had never been jewelers in France, and they weren't a permitted profession. So, in Aisha's view, the French had murdered her ancestral tradition. Well, it's a fascinating book, but it does come with a health warning. It's full of bitter anger, both against France and also against Israel, which had no interest back in the 50s and 60s in the Jewish cultures from Arabic-speaking lands. The book is a series of open letters written to friends, relatives, even long-deceased ancestors, filled with great longing for a world that had gone, a world where Jews and Muslims lived in peace. And that's why I'm telling you this story today on this Shabbat of comfort, because when we mourn, how we find comfort is so often built on our memories. So my final slide is of Aisha herself. She's Aisha because she adopted her grandmother's Arabic name. And here you can see her wearing her own threaded coins in memory of her ancestors. She is now a professor of modern culture and media at Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. So, to conclude, millions of Jews for centuries lived in harmony with Muslims in many lands. The way that Muslim culture shaped Jewish scholarship came to be an immense blessing. But the disruption between Judaism and Islam over the past 100 years and more has been an immense tragedy. If we are ever to have peace in the Middle East, there is a vast amount of reconciliation work to be done, not just between Jews and Palestinians, but also between Ashkenazim, Mizrahim, Sephardim, Haredim, between religious and secular, even between the nationalists and the internationalists. And those are my thoughts when I read this fascinating book by a woman who calls herself a Muslim Jew. Let us take comfort from the words of our Haftarah this morning, that God is the one who can bring down the hated rulers of the earth, as the people at that time had themselves witnessed. A new regime had arrived, and at last the people were free. Shabbat Shalom.